economics section of the class. This will be broken into 2 separate videos, and we'll see how long those run. First thing that we're going to do is talk about the definition and functions of economy. Definition, it's right here. An economy is a means of producing, distributing, and consuming goods. So you need to have all 3 of those elements. It's a means of producing, distributing, and consuming goods. All economies are based on the subsistence strategy, which is what we just spoke about at length in the last series of lectures. They form the basis of any economic system, and if you need a refresher on those, these are the different categories of subsistence strategy that we talked about in the subsistence lecture: hunting and gathering, pastoralism, horticulture, agriculture, and mixed strategies. Those are transitional between any of these others. Next, we'll talk about functions of economies. Now that we've got a definition under our belt, we'll talk about subsistence, reinforcing social ties, creating opportunities for personal prestige, and social stratification. We'll talk about each one of these individually as we go through. Okay, the first function is subsistence. This is the primary function of any economic system. The economy is based on your subsistence strategy, and the primary function of it is to make sure that people can survive. We've already run across one example of that in the past in the subsistence lecture, this whale down below. Excuse me, if you recall that was an example, used as an example of food sharing. And it showed how the whale was cut up and distributed to different people based on their role in procuring food, and also other familial and community obligations that people had to one another. That was called food sharing, and it was common among hunter-gatherers, and it illustrates the subsistence function of economy. Another function is reinforcing social ties. This is something we don't necessarily think about a lot, but it's true of most economic activity. If we give gifts to each other, often that creates or reinforces a close social tie that we have. We give gifts to our friends and family. Beyond that, though, even just normal interaction through trade creates and maintains relationships among people. Just the fact that you go to the same store every week, or attend the same classes or something else, any kind of economic activity creates relationships among people. You meet people, they know who you are, you know who they are. They may not be very close relationships, but they are relationships, and they do matter in the larger picture. Enhancing prestige is another important function of economy. We probably haven't gotten a definition of prestige yet, so here it is to the right. Prestige refers to the amount of respect given an individual within his or her cultural group. Prestige is the amount of respect given an individual within his or her cultural group. We're going to introduce a couple of other terms here that relate to the use of prestige in the economy. First is conspicuous consumption, and this is defined as consuming resources in order to enhance prestige. So we had to know what prestige was before we could talk about conspicuous consumption. We've got to the left are 2 examples of conspicuous consumption that probably everybody can relate to in our own culture. If you buy a large boat or a stretch Hummer, probably there's really no need for that in your life. I mean, you probably don't have any hobbies or jobs that require that sort of thing. They do cost a lot of money to maintain, and people are impressed when you buy them, and that is one of the reasons that people buy them in the first place. It's an example of they are examples of conspicuous consumption, consuming resources in order to enhance prestige. This happens. Oops, I went forward too far. This happens in many different cultures, not just our own. Excuse me. One example that's sort of a classic anthropological example of conspicuous consumption is the potlatch. That's P-O-T-L-A-C-H, and that is a ceremony that was practiced among Pacific Northwest Native American tribes. Actually, chieftains, I believe. And in this ceremony, what they would do, the society was broken into different clans, which were somewhat competitive with one another in terms of producing resources and producing more people and having influence in the group. And so what would happen is these different clans would compete in this ceremony. They would actually get together as many resources as they could for their clan, using all the relationships they had within their group. They would accumulate as much as they could, much stuff, and they would bring it to the potlatch, and they would give a bunch of it away to other groups that were less well off, and whatever was left, they would heap into a big bonfire and a big pile and set it on fire. So they would actually burn the stuff. This is not only an example of conspicuous consumption, whether you're actually using the stuff or whether you've used it up by burning it, it's consumption. So it's not only an example of conspicuous consumption, but it's also an example of the next thing in the list on the right here, which is a leveling mechanism. Sorry, I think he's popping up here. Leveling mechanism. A leveling mechanism is something that's designed to control the accumulation of wealth. You can have leveling mechanisms on other things as well, on power or prestige. We may revisit that later. But for the most part, in the economics section, we're talking about leveling mechanisms specifically with regard to the accumulation of wealth. Now, if you think about it, the potlatch, in order to gain the prestige, they have to dispose of the things. Right? So they get all the stuff they can together, household goods, ceremonial goods, whatever they have in the culture, whatever material culture they have that they can spare. They get it together. They either give it away or burn it. So that is the leveling mechanism. In order to get the prestige that they want from this transaction, they have to get rid of the stuff. They keep the stuff, and they're stingy. They don't. They have a word for that in every culture in the world. In many cases, it's the worst thing that you can possibly be. Right? They're holding on to resources that they don't technically need. Excuse me. So the potlatch example is an example of both conspicuous consumption of resources in order to enhance prestige, and leveling mechanisms, in that there's a mechanism built into the system by which they have to get rid of some of their wealth in order to get the prestige. Right. Tax brackets in the Western world work not as a perfect leveling mechanism, but they're kind of a leveling mechanism. The more you make, the higher percentage you're supposed to pay on your taxes. That is by no means an absolute leveling mechanism in the U.S. It doesn't prevent people from accumulating huge amounts of wealth, but it is a form of leveling mechanism in that it evens things out a little bit. All right. Next one is social stratification. If that's a term that we haven't heard yet, I don't remember whether we've introduced it. I think we did introduce it during the subsistence lectures. Social stratification, if you don't recall, refers to hierarchy. Right? It's a term that was borrowed from geology. Stratification is just layers of things. They imported that into the social sciences and added a social in front of it, and they're talking about layers of people, which is a hierarchy. You have people with different status in society. Let's see what we've got here. A couple of different examples. Three basic categories of social stratification are rank, caste, and class. And you've probably heard of all of these, or heard all of the terms. You may not have heard any of them explained before. I have a note at the top that specialized labor results from economic complexity. That is true. If we don't recall what specialized labor was, it's any labor that's not directly connected to subsistence work. So most of the labor that we're training to do in college is specialized labor. We're not trying to produce food, shelter, or clothing, or basic subsistence labor. So once we have specialized labor, it obviously can feed into these systems of hierarchy. If you recall, hunters and gatherers didn't really have a system of hierarchy. They were egalitarian societies. We could add that to the list as an absence of social stratification. In these other cases, they all result from economically more complex societies. First one is rank. Rank, we're going to classify these as in terms of achieved and ascribed status. Right? Those are two different terms which you probably haven't run across before. An achieved status is one that can change during your lifetime. Achieved can change during your lifetime. An ascribed status, as we see down here with the caste system, is one that cannot change during your lifetime. You're born into it and it never changes. Alright, so rank is an achieved status that is based only on prestige. Right. The other axes of power, social stratification are listed down below in the class section. Prestige, power, and wealth. All of those can impact your place in the hierarchy in a given society. But if you're in a ranking system, then wealth and power are most likely limited by the social structure or by leveling mechanisms. So basically you can accumulate prestige without constraint. So in a ranking system, it's an achieved status. It can change during your lifetime, and is based on prestige or respect given to you by your peers. Not necessarily on power, and not necessarily on wealth, because you can't accumulate as much of those things. Alright, a caste system is an ascribed status. Right, so that cannot change during your lifetime. It is based on prestige as well, so it's like a ranking system, but it's an ascribed status. Can't change during your lifetime. Doesn't necessarily have direct ties to power and wealth. Right, it's based on prestige still, respect from your peers. I have to the left simple sketch of, let's get rid of that thing at the bottom, a simple sketch of the caste system in India. And that was made illegal under the British occupation, but it still exists in the public psyche. People still understand what caste they're in. There's some stories about that I could tell, but we won't get into that here in the interest of time. Excuse me. These are the basic different castes, and each one corresponds more or less to a set of occupations. So the Brahmin caste is the priestly caste, and then there's a warrior caste, and I suppose a trade caste, and then there's I'm not sure what the next lower one. At the very bottom, if I get my thing out of the way so we can see the very bottom of the thing, is the untouchables, which are actually not part of the caste system. They're separate from it. And so they end up doing pretty much all the jobs that nobody else has any interest in doing. All the ones that are sort of considered dirty in this excuse me, Hindu caste system. And this is part of the Hindu religion as well. It's based in that. And they don't overtly say that you can't progress from one caste to another. It's just that it can't happen during your lifetime, which is why we defined it, ascribed status as we did, something that can't change during your lifetime. In the Hindu system, you can make progress, but you do it through living a good life and then being reincarnated. Right, so you could start off down here, and if you live a perfect life, then you could be elevated to this one in your next reincarnation. Maybe you could go through 50 or 60 incarnations and get to this one, right? So so there is mobility. Oh, social mobility. That's another term that I should probably add in here. There is social mobility in that you can move from one caste to another, but only after you're dead. So it really doesn't affect your life. Usually anthropologists are mostly focused on what happens during your life. So that's the big difference between a caste system and a ranking system. Ranking system, your status can change during your life. Frequently does. Caste system, you're stuck in that one until you die. You might be able to get reincarnated into another one, maybe not, depends on the caste system. Using the Indian caste, the Hindu caste system, because it's the one people have most commonly heard of. There are others in the world. Alright, a class system, if I can get my notes out of the way here. Class system is more variable, and this thing keeps popping up in my way. It's more variable in that it can be ascribed or achieved. Ascribed or achieved status, depending on where you find it. It can also be based on prestige, power, and wealth. Right. So all three of those axes of stratification can contribute to your position in a class system. So it's the more complex of the three. That's also the system that we have in the United States. And in the United States, class is an achieved status, in that while you may be born into a class, I suppose everyone is, that certainly can change. You know, you can be born into a top 1% class and or the upper class, and have all sorts of problems and lose all your money and lose your position and go all the way down to the lower class or the working class or the underclass. Even we have an underclass in our system, people who are kind of outside of the economic system. It could also work the other way around. You could be born into the underclass into a family that really is outside of the system, maybe part of the illegal economy, and you know, go to college, get educated, you know, have a couple of breaks, find some good jobs, do a good job, and eventually make a lot of money, and you can work your way up the system. And that's part of our ideology in the United States. Came out of the liberal enlightenment. Social mobility is something that's important in our ideology. That's what makes the system work to a large extent. If we didn't believe, if people in different classes in the United States didn't believe that there was a possibility for moving out of their class, then they'd be a lot more discontented with the class system in general. Right. But it's been working for a couple of hundred years, actually more than that if you go back to the origin of it. So we have a class system. It is an achieved status. It is not an ascribed status. It can change during your lifetime. that's the end of this section. So we'll break off here, and we'll move on to the next one.